Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 214, Church to School, Gospel in Academia with Dr. Emorja Roberson. For those who sing Black sacred music, it is the Academy of the Black Church that taught us, Dr. Roberson will say later in this episode. He will also make a challenge or two in this episode. One is to see if you are a convincing performer of this art form. Go to a Black church and sing it. See how they receive you. In this episode, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Emorja Roberson, who is the first African American DMA in choral conducting from Notre Dame. He is a choral conductor and passionate gospel music researcher and teacher. We dove into the rich cultural and spiritual significance of gospel music, exploring its evolution and global reach. Dr. Roberson emphasized the importance of understanding the cultural context when performing gospel music, while I raised some questions about the line between appreciation and appropriation. We also touch on the impact of the George Floyd movement on various institutions, the role of Black composers, and the challenge of maintaining authenticity in diversifying music education. Dr. Roberson shared his unique approach to teaching through immersive experiences in Black churches, highlighting communal and participatory elements that are often missed in just an academic setting. Our conversation also explored a possible tension between university and church in teaching gospel music and the importance of experiencing the music within its cultural roots. Finally, at the end, we discuss some practical advice on teaching gospel music to predominantly white choirs, emphasizing respect and immersion in the culture. It was a powerful and insightful conversation that I'm excited for you to hear. And also, you will hear that Emorja has picked up a torch that Marques Garrett lit in the first year of this show and challenging me to go back to a predominantly Black church and keep learning. So stick around all the way to the end and have your thinking stimulated and challenged, and then of course weigh in yourself with your related ideas and experiences on Facebook in the Choralosophers group or over on Substack at choralosophy.substack.com. Calling all concert planners. Let's talk about Ludus. It's more than just a ticketing platform. It's a game changer for event management. Picture this: simplified ticketing, seamless marketing, powerful fundraising, and now, brand new this year, volunteer management, all for free to you and your organization. Thousands of organizations trust Ludus, and you should too. Elevate your events with Ludus. Sign up at ludus.com/choralosophy today and experience the difference. Don't forget, it pays to listen to this show if you are a music educator. The list of discounts and benefits for listeners just keeps growing, so your checklist for back to school means getting your sheet music at graphitepublishing.com or endeavormusicpublishing.com, sight reading materials from sightreadingfactory.com along with your student memberships every time you renew, acquire folders and other classroom materials from mymusicfolders.com, and now, most recently, your sub-plans, your ready-made activities and assessments related to music theory can be generated for you with your 3minutetheory.com membership. All of these great vendors accept the Choralosophy discount code. When you check out, you're going to get money saved for your program that helps you take your school year farther. So make sure you hit all of those websites, and it supports this show. Underwriting and crucial support for this show comes from listeners themselves who choose to subscribe on Patreon or now on Substack. Subscribers get access to the private podcast feed as well as my Google folder full of goodies and much more. The producers on Patreon are Brian Long, Venture Studios, Jonah Clixbull, Angie Schilling, Danelle Eckert, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kakachik. All right, everybody, I'm here with Dr. Emorja Roberson, and we are going to be talking about a lot of things related to our musical tastes and interests and our teaching and our passions and all those things and how they tie together. But I thought I would share first, before we kick it over, that I found Emorja on Instagram, and I was just scrolling through and hearing this beautiful baritone voice. Honestly, the first time I saw you, I didn't realize you were a choir person. I actually, when in just scrolling through the feed, thought you were a singer, performer, that was kind of how your identity is. But we'll talk more about how you think of yourself as a musician in a minute. Dr. Roberson, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it, man.
This will be fun. Why don't you first tell us a little bit about your background? Where do you come from? Which part of the country? What kind of stuff do you do for a living every day?
Yeah, so Born in Florida, and born in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Moved to the Phoenix in Florida at a young age. Went to school at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville. From there, graduated in 2013, and then I went up to the University of Notre Dame in 2015 to do my master's. Started my doctorate in 2019, finished in 22, moved down here to Oxford, Georgia, August 22. So I am the assistant professor of music and African American studies at Oxford College of Emory University. And here I am able to fulfill my research agenda by studying the rituals, the figures, and like the performance practice of 20th century gospel music. And so that manifests in different ways. But essentially, yeah, I do. I mean, I sing, I write. Well, I guess if I was being technical, I compose. I conduct. But I just enjoy music and all the ways that I just make it work. That helps me to best express myself.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. So tell me a little bit more about this research first that you're doing, in the sense of, is it as just partly because I've never taught at the university level, is it something you do just because it's part of your job, or is this a passion project, or what exactly is going on there?
Certainly a passion. So when I was at Notre Dame, so little story with Notre Dame. So in 2017, I graduated with my master's of shaking music and vocal performance. I was the first African American to get this degree, and I was also the first to get my doctorate in musical arts and choral conducting. And the focus there, once I got to the doctoral level, as they knew during my master's experience, is that gospel. Like that's what I love, African American sacred music. And I loved other music as well too, but at Notre Dame, because it was a sacred music department, it only helped to expand and create this ecumenical experience that they were wanting to afford all of their students.
Yeah.
So this is really like what I do now is honestly the extension of what I grew up doing. But now I'm able to discuss it from different angles. I can discuss the history and how the history helps the music to have this pertinence. So it all makes sense, but it's certainly a passion project that's being lived out.
Yeah. So, and then tell us a little bit more about your teaching responsibilities there at the school. Do you direct choir? Do you teach courses? Both? How does that work?
Yeah, so I do both actually. So Oxford College is the beginning of it's where Emory started essentially, and it's a liberal arts college, 1,000 students, and so I teach Oxford Choral, and then I also teach other courses. So, for example, some things that I have taught, there's Intro to Music, which is of course every year, and then I've taught Music Cultures of the World. I've brought in a couple of courses, for example, Black Artistry, where we looked at the soundtracks as it relates to how Black people are characterized in movies. So we looked at movies from different eras. We looked at Dolomite. We looked at Car Wash. We looked at all of these things to see how we have evolved as characters and how the music helps to tell the story. Then I
Hmm.
taught a class on case studies of hip hop lyrics. We looked at some stuff with Kanye, early Kanye, and then seeing how this evolution started to take place as it relates to related to him and gospel. So we did some we had some discussions on that. And my new course, taught a course called Black Church, Black Music last semester, where I took my students around the Covington area, which is essentially the community that we're in. And we looked at different churches. We went to the plantation that is now called Burge, um, like a farm that they have out there, and seeing where the enslaved went to school, seeing how they're taking care of that, but also seeing how the church, what did the church represent during that time, and are we still upholding that same purpose now?
Hmm.
And so now the course I'm starting this semester, which is where the goal is to make this a requirement for major and minor, is the globalization of gospel music. We've seen gospel tend to grow longer legs in these educational spaces. And of course, whenever we get to university levels or we get to maybe even high schools, we see this soft gospel that is culturally, it's a nice cultural aspect to add in at the end of a concert where it's like the wow factor. But there's more to gospel than just performing it in the sense, but what comes with performing it? There are those who do it on the educational side, and then there are those who do it because that is part of their being. They grew up doing it. There's a cultural phenomenon with it, and then there's a religious side of it. And so, how do we, for those who didn't grow up in it, how can you do this stuff? And also looking at appropriation as well too. So But the course will look at from that aspect. We'll start in the U.S. and then we'll go over to Cuba and look and see how it has been performed there. We'll look at Japan. We'll look at Malawi. We'll look at the
Hmm.
Caribbean, how those gospel artists have been received in those countries, and then what they take from those countries and bring back to the Americas. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's really what I do.
Wow. That is really, really interesting, and there's several things that strike me there about your story. One, you mentioned even just the bringing in of like concepts of appropriation, and I wonder if you've ever noticed. Have you noticed? And I know you haven't done the international research part of it yet, but it seems to be that people from outside of the United States that look at gospel and they for example, they might just jump in and try to start singing some songs, and they really have no idea what the culture is or what the music really sounds like here. But people all around the world love it and love gospel music, and they will form gospel choirs full of 20 little old
Mhm.
Polish ladies will have a gospel choir, and and there doesn't seem to be that same sensitivity that people from outside of the United States are appropriating American culture. It seems like a conversation that we have. Just it's like we're fighting in our amongst ourselves about it, but the little old Polish ladies are not involved in that conversation at all. You ever notice that?
Yeah, and it's always so interesting to me because as someone who grew up performing this sacred art form, the Academy of the Black Church is what taught us. It is
Hmm.
those experiences where we had the church anniversaries, choir anniversaries, 3 p.m. services, usher anniversaries. We traveled to these conventions. Those are the moments that taught us how to do what we do. Working from the aspect of in the beginning year, my formative years, going to church where they didn't have the best sound system. It was like 2 good microphones and some good acoustics in the church, but we made it work. And I say that there is this experience that comes with the way in which gospel is performed. It's those experiences. And to see how other people, I'm even say this, there's a difference when people actually take the time to understand and study gospel and its performative aspects, and then those who just do it because it looks cool to do. And I tell people this to see if you are really a convincing performer of this art form, you go to a black church in the country. Those people who sing gospel, who sing hymns, who sing spirituals are on their back porch. And I want you to sing it in their church to see how they receive you. Because one thing about it, you could take away all the fancy, the bells and whistles, but at the core of it, people should be able to feel what you're singing. And we are a culture of feeling like that experience is something certainly based upon feeling, but if that religious if the spiritual aspect connects with that cultural aspect, then you'll know when you're well received. And so yeah, to the Polish ladies, I would love to see that done.
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing, and I think part of it is just a um, we're we're naturally going to understand as Americans, because even myself, I didn't grow up in the gospel church in a gospel
Mhm.
music environment, but I sure have grown up knowing what that sounds like because
Yeah.
I have proximity to that music. Because maybe there's a church that some of my friends from school go to who sing that kind of music or whatever. So I have that experience, but the little Polish ladies don't. They don't
Yeah.
have they don't have even proximity to gospel music. So what do you think it is about gospel music, even though they don't have that proximity, that it's causing people all around the world to have their own outcroppings of almost fandom for this American art form?
Yeah, well, because I sort of think about it. Well, Dvorak said how, as far as the spiritual is essentially, just paraphrasing, the spiritual is the sound of America.
Hmm.
We look at Gary T. Burley, we look at the arranged spirituals, and we look at how it lives and how it's being expressed through the bodies of those people who have a close connection with that experience, that musical experience, that lyrical content. And so, like, I think about the artists, for example, like Edwin Hawkins, how their music went to other countries. They went to other countries as well too. There were these festivals that people would have in these countries where they would bring in the gospel artists, Mahalia Jackson, Rosetta Tharpe. People saw how alive their music was, and because of that, people were just drawn to this experience. And so after that, people were like, well, how can I get a piece of this too? But which is great because I love that the music lives. But the way that people see the music being lived out on stage is through a personal experience. So, like me and my friend, we have this joke. We're like, whenever gospel choirs from the States go over to the other country, they always want to see the fat lady in the robe singing "Oh Happy Day." Like, and that's all they think about because it's like, and we know, like, we know it's a joke, but it's so true but it's what people know, and so I think because gospel has been traveling so much over there that it's just grown its own legs, and gospel's also even performed in Brazil. There's a buddy of mine who is out that way who does a lot of research on it, and but there's a need for it, and sometimes, you know, I know in the Bible it says how a prophet sometimes isn't received well in his own town or his own city or country, whatever. But if we go to other places, no, it's well received. He's well received, and I think about that when it comes to this Black artistry. You see more of it now in the sense of it being appreciated in the collegiate space, where the spiritual sometimes isn't the only Black art form that we see. There's music that carries these idiomatic, aspects of the Black culture, and sometimes I've seen that people have been afraid to do it, especially in the States, because they're like, "Are we allowed to do this?" And
Right.
it's like, yes, you can do it, but it takes some studying. Now, I believe every song has you got to lead carefully with whatever song you do. I don't know what it would be like in the States or even across seas to hear someone sing the spiritual "I've been buked and I've been scorned." I don't think so.
Mm.
Uh, but I do believe that there are certain parts of the spiritual, or there are certain spirituals that are certainly necessary to be performed by those who are not of African descent.
Yeah. I think I hear what you're saying, and that is that there's a spectrum for all of this, where
Mhm.
you could go into some very well. I'll just use a metaphor. How about this? Um, at my school, I teach at a public school. You can sing sacred music in a public school, but you
Mhm.
probably shouldn't pull out like a church choir anthem about Christ hanging from the cross and his blood spilling out, and all of it, which you can sing those songs in church, but you take that into the public school and it can. So I think that the metaphor I'm using there is really more about like, yes, white people and other ethnicities they can sing gospel music, but there's maybe some aspects of it that might not be the best idea to jump into and have that be your first experience. And so that's where the study comes in. Is that a decent summary?
Yeah, well, I would even say so. I would say that gospel for those who are, particularly for those who are in churches, yes. If you based upon the abilities of your singers, based upon the musicians you have and how skilled they are, I do believe gospel is very accessible in the sense of um, different levels of musicianship and how that can also help with you and how that can also play a part in your group. For example, I know that we live in a world now where a lot of gospel has been transcribed, and we do our best to put everything on paper for the musician who may not be able to pick it up by ear. But certain things in gospel really just come by experience. It comes by just being in the moment. Sometimes we can play chords that are not even transcribed, but it comes by being immersed in that experience. And so for the church choir that may not, be the ambassadors of gospel music, I tell anybody when you read what's on the paper, it's a snapshot. But sometimes the colorful chords may not be in there. But you sometimes you got to listen to more music, and so in order for you to become skilled in this art form, you got to listen to other things. You got to get around those people who know more than you. Like it's literally one of those moments where you're being mentored, and you take that back to your church choir because, like I tell a lot of people, there is still a sound. There's a gospel choir sound, and if if I were to close my eyes, and I think sometimes we can somewhat sense this as well. But if I were to close my eyes and there were two choirs, one that was Black and one that was non-Black, you can tell based on the quality of the voice which choir is Black. There are certain nuances that also take place that can't always be written
Mm-hmm.
uh, written down. And one thing I tell people, you can't write down timbre. Um, those things just come from being a part of the culture. Like there's this book called The Race of Sound that has a really good explanation for, it goes into like even the classical realm. And one of my buddies, Patrick Daly, is a part of one of the interviews of that book. But it's like it is certainly it certainly comes from the experience. So all in all, yes, I do believe a choir can do it, but they also need to know where they can. They also need to know what song best represents them for that group of singers.
Yeah, yeah. I've read The Race of Sound, by the way. It's a very interesting read. I recommend it to people listening.
Yeah.
So okay, so yeah, that's all really good, and I agree. I agree with all of that. I think what you're describing though is kind of cross cultural in a variety of ways, and I want to see what you think about this. In that, everything you just said about gospel music is also true about certain types of culturally specific music that was kind of raised under certain cultural contexts, and then we might hear it like so now I'm going to think, okay, now we're in the continent of Asia somewhere, and there's a certain music that we don't ever get the benefit of hearing that really in our day-to-day life and our day-to-day culture. We also could go as Americans over there and we could listen to it for a little while. We could kind of get how the notes and rhythms go, and we could start playing it or singing it. But ultimately, they would be able to listen to us right away, and they would know that we are not we are not from the culture, right? And so yeah, it's an interesting. That book is a really interesting way of describing that. And also, there's aspects that I pulled out of that book too that were part of it is cultural, but part of it is also linguistic. There are certain ways that we talk that then also color the way we sing. That was a terrible pun, but you know what I mean. And so thoughts about that too, that linguistic connection and is that something that you notice?
Yeah, and one thing. So I did my research. My dissertation was on Donald Lawrence, and gospel artist. North Carolina, now lives in not sure, lives in Chicago, and I was discussing three of his pieces. Um, but it was essentially talked about the concert stage, the church choir, the theatrical. Donald Lawrence went to school, got his degree in theater, and one thing about Donald Lawrence is the way in which I don't want to say dramatizes his work, but he's very intentional with what he does, from the outfits, from the aesthetic that we see, and then also like the setup even on the stage. And I looked at his second album, Bible Stories, and it does that. When I had my interview with Donald, he was telling me that when he teaches his music, he doesn't teach his choir by words; he teaches them phonetics. And I was like, huh, interesting. And so by doing that, linguistics, all of that, it draws and it picks up on certain colors of the voice that just can't be that we can read the same word, two different backgrounds, we can say it a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with that, I think about the conversation you had with Dr. Andre Thomas when you said there's no, I think you said no perfect English or something.
Oh,
Um
mm-hmm.
form or standard English, but it's like we have our different interpretations of English because you got the Gullah Geechee folks, like they have their own, way that they speak. I've heard that some Appalachians have their own style of speaking,
Yeah.
but that speaks to the culture in which we are a part of. So yeah, linguistics certainly plays a strong part in it. And can you learn linguistics from other countries? Certainly you can. Like people can do it. I also feel that you should do what's most authentic to you. But I know in certain settings, when we are, in the choral choir or in the choral in the chorus, we have to ensure that we blend. So it takes work. It takes a lot of
Mm-hmm.
work. But yeah, that's what I
Mm-hmm.
think.
Now, I'm curious about your thoughts about your how you define yourself as a choral musician. We all love to travel with our students, but we definitely don't love planning a trip. I know I've been there as the point person for details, and it is a nightmare. Forms, payments, fundraising, it's a never-ending task that takes away from doing what we love. That's where Kaleidoscope Adventures comes in. They've been planning performance trips for more than 30 years and handle all the details from start to finish. And one of the best parts about Kaleidoscope, they have crowdfunding options for every traveler. Contact Kaleidoscope Adventures at mykatrip.com to find out how they can take your travel beyond expectations. because of course you have a doctoral degree in choral conducting, and your passion is gospel music. Do you think of yourself as a gospel musician first and a choral musician second? How do you even think about that? Like, so how would you describe that to us?
Hmm, that's a really good question. When I was applying for jobs, my professor said, Emorja, she said, you do two things. She said, you sing and you conduct. She said, you want to be a singer who conducts or a conductor who sings? I said, that is really interesting. And because she's like, that's how you will market yourself. And so for the longest time, in my mind, I was like, okay, there's a singer, there's a conductor, there's the composer, and I have to find ways to separate all of this. I started doing my work here at Oxford, and for the longest time, it was so hard for me to talk about these three different people in this one body. But I'm like, each one informs the other. And that is how I educate. That is how I teach. That is how I perform. When you get immersed to the singer, you're getting the conductor as well too, because the conductor has ears where you listen to. Well, I'll say even also the singer as well too, but the conductor, I'm attentive. I also base what I do off the audience, but as a conductor, and especially when I grew up in church, you base how much you repeat certain motives based on the energy of the audience. The audience is helping to determine the temperature of the room. So I I would even stray away from just saying that I'm a gospel musician. Now, is that my specialty? Yes. That what my research agenda is in, certainly. But I have 2 degrees where I study classical voice. Like I've done the operas, I record the projects, I've recorded with Arturo Sandoval. I've recorded did some stuff with like Roger Steptoe's As You Like It. I've done those things and still can just perform as a soloist for the Brahms Requiem at Notre Dame for the presenting series. So, and I know a lot of times my social media shows me doing gospel because I don't always have a string quartet to sort of record stuff with me to put on.
Right.
but I like to sometimes be a wild card for people. I
Yeah.
like, and you
What?
know, go ahead.
So I was going to ask. So you mentioned the not having string quartet all around you to do that every once in a while, but it seems like from looking at your feed of all the singing that you put on your Instagram and your TikTok, you are around gospel music on a regular basis. This is like you're not just studying it academically, you're in it in your
Yeah,
life. Is that right?
yeah, yeah. It's very true. And even just music. So although there's gospel, even the music that even comes from just the music along the black music continuum, essentially. So I look at stuff as far as from like hip hop. I look at the jazz stuff. I look at all of that. But yeah, certainly African American sacred music is certainly where my heart is. And but I find ways, like I tell myself, I find ways where I incorporate that into other things that I do. Like how does studying that help me to listen to other music? And yeah, so that's my bread and butter, but
Yeah.
not limited. I love
Now,
it.
one thing I thought was also striking about your life in when I was thinking about talking to you is that choral music has come so far in the 20 years that I've been doing it. I don't know when I was in college if I had ever even heard of a person doing a choral conducting degree with an emphasis in gospel music. Like,
Mm,
I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, I guess for me it would be closer to 25 years ago from when I was in college. I don't think I had ever even heard of that.
mm.
And so is that something that is, you mentioned being the first African American to get a couple different degrees at the school you went to. Are these things, the things you're doing now, is this a sign of progress?
Yes. I progress in where I'm at. For example, at Notre Dame Catholic institution, there really weren't. They were the people there really didn't know how to unpack gospel, and so I'm grateful for my professor Margot Faster because she also helped to start the Sigma's department over at Yale. She understood the importance of what this was. She understood how this music worked and why it was so necessary. So, yes, I do believe that there is progress, at least from what I can see. Now, does that mean that every school is as receptive? I can't say. I can't say just yet because some people do feel like gospel isn't even worth a discussion because some people may feel that it's not art. But we just look at, we see that people, as I've told folks, people have enough awareness to program, at least, the spiritual, the arranged spiritual, and call it a day. But it's like there are more composers out there, and as much as we love them, outside of Moses Hogan, outside of Paul Johnson, there's William Dawson. There are so many others. And the beautiful thing about it is this, because we have different ways in which the Black musician interprets their stories through music without having to use the Western European lens. We can choose from an array of the ways in which the story is being told. You have those that hint towards maybe a little bit of R&B. You have those that may hint towards a little bit of gospel, and you also have your composers who write to ensure that it mirrors some of the elements that we see in classical music. So, yes, there is progress, and there's also expansion. And I also wonder, um, as I've had this discussion as well too, the whole George Floyd effect.
Mm.
And is that effect still in effect, or are we starting to sort of come down off of that high or low rather? Because I think a lot of people were doing things to try to show the Black community how woke they were. They want to be more intentional with doing things to show that they were on board. When it, I saw just from where I was at Notre Dame,
Yeah.
it was enough to it was a band-aid. But as that band-aid gets old, what are we doing with it?
Right.
Is it has it healed? So I think even in the larger aspect of music, I think we could just be more intentional with that as well.
Yeah. Now, I think I know what you mean, but I want to get you to see if you can say a little bit more. When you say the George Floyd effect, what do you mean? Because I hear people say stuff like that, and they mean lots of different things by that. So when you say that, what do you mean?
So what I say by that, I mean there are people who white people who are stakeholders in certain positions are seeing how the Black students are being affected on their campus, but also at large, and they know that if they don't run to the rescue of the Black person to show how much they care about what just happened, then they are bound to be on the chopping block. So what do? They support their endeavors financially. They show up probably in ways, and if they can't show up, then they'll send money. But they are open to hearing their ideas. They're wanting to know the 12 steps to cure racism. And my answer to that is we didn't create it, so I can give you an answer for it. But it's like, and as we get away from that, I want those same opportunities that were there to ensure that we were heard and we were acknowledged are still in place, 4 or 5 years later. And that goes for collegiate programs as well too. Like we saw during that time, there was this. We saw people looking at Florence Price. We saw people looking at all of these Black women composers as well too. And it's like, oh, where have they been? So yeah, that's essentially what I mean. Long story
Okay.
short.
So you think in some ways it's that year of 2020 caused people to almost like have their apple cart upset. Like the apples are now spilled everywhere, and we've got the white people, as you said before, in 2020, we're kind of panicked to run around and make sure we've got all the apples, right? Almost like we gotta make sure that we're not offending anyone. We know that everybody's sensitivities are really high, and so with that came some very genuine, I think, attempts to make certain things better, mixed together with the less than genuine. This is the trend right now, so we're going to be very public with our wokeness or whatever. And it got difficult for people, I think, in 2020 and 2021 to tell which was which. Am I seeing the woke signaler of their virtue, or am I seeing the person who's just like genuinely trying to help and make things better? Is that something that you noticed, or am I crazy?
Yeah. No, I mean, you're exactly right. And, the reason it was hard to tell what was what is because we also had a mask to hide behind.
There you go. Mm.
So there's a lot of the showing concern. There are two ways. There are people who, are white and even other, ethnicity, but those who are white particularly, you could feel their heart. You could feel the passion, and you could feel if it was passionate or if it was performative. And you see that based upon how they acted and how they walked and how they lived after that happened. And I look at people to see if they're still doing it now. Uh, but yeah, I do believe America is in a different space now. Not to say better or worse, but we are in a space in the sense of we don't have folks who are afraid to fight back, in the sense of voicing the importance of our presence in certain spaces. As we know, like there's always been this internal fight in the sense of wanting to be acknowledged. And unfortunately, as we know, America had to be shut down. The world had to be shut down. We had to sit and watch this man, die in front of our eyes in order for people to listen. Of course, and COVID played a strong part in all of that as well too.
Mm-hmm.
Always wonder, like, if we didn't have COVID, would we have the change that we really see or we thought we saw?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
I think it had to be both things at the same time.
yeah,
Yeah, I think because if we hadn't had the pandemic when George Floyd was killed, then people wouldn't have been forced to all be paying attention to that story at the same time.
yeah,
People would have been they would have been busy. They would have been doing their normal lives with their two jobs or whatever. And some people would have heard about that news story about George Floyd, and some people didn't hear about it. And it would have, I think it would have just been like another police killing that
yeah.
that runs across the news. And I mean, that's just, of course, not we can't know. Well,
Right.
but that's just my opinion. I feel like it needed to be almost like we had to look at George Floyd from a fishbowl, like from outside a fishbowl,
Yeah,
and COVID stuck us in that.
it really did. And it's funny, you made me think about, I totally forgot about this. That was a year, of course, at Notre Dame finished up my doctorate, and that was my second recital that I had to do in 2021. Yeah, 2021. And I remember that's when I did William Grant Stills and They Lynched Him on a Tree. And I dedicated that, of course, to George Floyd. And I remember I walked out on the stage. Mind you, we were in the Performing Arts Center, or the Performance Hall, rather. No one in there. Choir was spaced out every which way you could find. But I remember I walked out with my bag of Skittles and my Lipton tea before I got on the podium to conduct. And that was just a really heavy concert. There was so much happening. The theme of "And They Lynched Him on a Tree," like at that moment, I thought about James Combs, the cross and the lynching tree. I even thought about how George Floyd's murder was a modern version of being lynched. Um, so there are so many instances in the Black American life where we can draw this through line, of how we see this narrative and how we've seen it being played out throughout years. Even Billie Holiday, "Strange Fruit." Um, yes, and I think the art, or the role of the composer, the Black composer, is to continue to tell the stories of the experiences of Black people through the music that makes the most sense and that really tells who they are and who they're trying to also attract. Um, like Ollie Wilson talks about that in one of his articles, and it's true. So yeah, 2020 was certainly a year that was eye opening for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the other things you said a minute ago was that one of the ways we can, or that you feel like you can tell the sincere, the sincere person that wants to diversify music education, choral music, for all the right reasons, like for the not the reasons that it allows them to get to make a presentation at a convention and look super cool, or or whatever, but you can tell, versus the ones who are kind of virtue signaling. And you mentioned that it was whether or not they're still doing it, like
Mhm.
whether or not that is still something that they're involved in, and also whether or not you really get the sense that they're sincere because you have some kind of a connection with them. And I feel like that resonated with me because that's something I'm passionate about, and
Yeah.
in communicating on this show, is that we actually have to continue to have conversations, even just like the one you and I are having right now, and they have to happen as a way for me to understand a culture. For example, I have to talk to people from that culture.
Yeah.
There is no, you can't read a culture in a textbook and understand it.
Yeah. You gotta go.
you know. And so what my I guess my question, I'll kick back to you, kind of considering that, is that now having this academic approach to gospel music and to the broader culture that gave gospel music its birth, you are potentially in a situation where you're now trying to teach a culture from a textbook, right? Which, and so then what? How do you try? How do you balance? Okay, this is now an academic thing that we're going to try to make research and we're going to make text about and we're going to write about it, but we also want to preserve it as an authentic cultural thing. Is that a tension you've ever thought about? And what do you think?
It's so funny. When I taught my black church, black music course, actually go back to the oratorio that I wrote at Notre Dame. When I did this, when I did my oratorio be spoken in 22, I I found we had these conversations in our rehearsals about, gospel and, all those things, just as we have done with Black church, Black music here that I taught at Emory. And I, at one point, I had to tell my folks where they're like, y'all, listen, I know we've read certain things about this Black experience, this Black church experience, but let me just prepare you just in case, because there may be some things that you'll see that you have never seen before. So yes, so we do the readings of it. We look at why the Black church or how the Black church became the Black church. We look at people who like the Free African Society, Richard Allen, the AME Church. We look at the Great Awakening. We look at these composers, Charles Tinley, Sally Martin, Lucy, all of these folks, and how they helped to create this sonic imprint or even backbone or foundation for what we would typically hear in the Black church during certain eras. And mind you, the Black church, and I'll say that within air quotes, is not a monolith. There are different examples of the Black church. So when I talk about this, I'm also talking about those that are expressive in their worship, those that embody those musical characteristics that come directly from West Africa. So anyway, so yeah, so I marry the theory with the practice. And how I do that is my students read, and then we go to some of the churches around here. I took them to one of the churches down the street here. We did three different examples. So we went to a smaller church here where it was, very quaint, very intimate kind of service. And I had a couple students who also went up for prayer during that time. For those who grew up in the church, they understood what that meant. And I had one student who actually spoke at the church in the sense of, and I don't know if you've ever been to a Black church before, but they're going to ask about like if there are any visitors who may want to stand and say something. Now, mind you, it's a very small church. So they were asking for if we have any visitors there when we took up half the church. So it was like, we couldn't say, they couldn't act like we weren't there. But one of my students stood up and he said, no, I want to thank you all so much for, welcoming us and so on and so forth. So I was like, okay, bet. Experience number one is the communal experience of the Black church. He tapped into that already. All right. And so there's, of course, there's a strong desire for participation. You'll know when it's time to sit for the presentation, i.e., the sermon, which at some point will include these participatory aspects as well. So then we go to another church where it's a little larger. They have more resources. Now they have cameras. My students are now on the screens. And so they're starting to see themselves. And it's like, whoa, where are we? But you see the people, once again, they're charismatic. They're enjoying the service. I'm a part of the service as well, too, just by regular engagement. And so then our third big project, which was a capstone project, I took them to the church right around the corner called Rush Chapel United Methodist Church, which was built by the enslaved Africans. And so it's also part of Oxford College's history as well. But I had a big community project over there where we performed Black hymnody. We did the 4-part anthem. We had the gospels and we had the devotion. We had all of these things. So my students sat in the back and they see this material that we've read in class being fleshed out in real time. They're seeing how I engage with the choir. They're seeing how I engage with, the service itself. I'm not necessarily Dr. E. I'm just Emorja. I'm in church and I'm enjoying myself. So I think sometimes as educators, we sometimes take ourselves out of the mix, but it's our experience that helps us to educate. And I was a little fearful, like, so what happens if, I get in my element, as we all do, and we just be like, oh gosh, is that really our professor up there, shouting and dancing in church? Yeah, like that's what we do. So, but I wanted my students to get that, because the only way for them to understand is to be there so they could feel what it felt like. You can't feel it in a book. You can read it, get all the knowledge that you need. But the feeling comes from the experience of being around those people who are living those stories that are being told through music, that's being told through the sermon, and how they see themselves as the characters in the sermon. And yeah, that's essentially the power of Black music, and just part of the African culture that we see lived out in the Black church.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, I have been to a black church. I I have an episode about it actually. You should check it out. It's from a few years ago. I called
Okay.
the episode "The Only White Guy in the Room," and I brought my camera and my microphones and everything, and I went to Maria Ellis's church. And
Oh yeah.
yeah, and so I got to hang out with her for that day, and it was pretty good. And then afterwards, we talked about what it was like for me to be there, and that was the episode. I think it's like episode number 78 or something. And you're going to be
Uh,
like episode 214 or something like
I'm
that. So it
I'm
was it
watching
was
it, man.
it was a while ago, but yeah, it's a good one. So along those same lines of the gospel art form as this culturally unique, specific to a context and a setting. We talked about how it was, in many ways, a spiritual experience for people. In some cases, this cultural phenomenon, right? And then now we've added this academic aspect of it where it's being studied. So I'm going to ask you a bizarre, maybe even like a bizarre thought experiment question. So we've got, with the progress that has been made in the university, even if it's George Floyd effect or not, just that it's progress in that there are these degree programs now where musicians can study and write dissertations in and specialize in Black sacred music. So here's the thought experiment. We fast forward 300 years from now. This progress has been continuing. Could the university, the academic institution in the United States, ever become better at teaching gospel music than the Black church could?
No. Um, and I say,
Yeah.
ah, let me. Okay, okay, and here's why. You can teach the music, but you also got to take people to the space where the music started and where the music continues to reside. Now, here's the other catch. It depends, because gospel is evolving so much. A lot of times, people's idea of gospel is that choir. A lot of churches don't really have choirs now. Do they exist? Yes, that they do exist. But you see mainstream, you see more of the groups that sing in church, and some of the music isn't always identifiable as gospel. It's a mesh between CCM and that, with a gospelized angle, I guess. Um, so I would be really curious to know what these schools teach when they teach gospel. But I believe if you're going to talk about all of it, because you got to see how it continues to expand. And doing that, like I tell anybody, you got to go back to the foundation to know why it began the way it began. Why did Thomas Dorsey consider this stuff to be gospel? Why did he move from, whenever he moved from, Villa Rica, Georgia, up to Chicago and started playing at the churches up there? So, but if you're going to a Black church, I'm trying to back up. Can the school teach you better than the Black church? No, but the school and those who study can give the evidence, uh, and can give the timeline, can give the pedagogy of the Black church, can help you to understand its ritualistic practices, or its rituals, because ritual is essentially, performative, it's practice, but can help people to understand, because you don't get all of that. You don't get that in the church. You get the experience. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
That makes sense. So now I want to kind of take you to why I thought of that question. So I think about that question with what we now consider like European classical music. a lot of that music that we consider, that we apply that label to, was somebody's church music 300 or 400 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then the things that were solidified as as best practices or whatever in that on that continent at that time, a lot of that knowledge distilled down into what is now the university, the university, right? And so I'm thinking like, but at the same time, by me studying Bach in undergrad, I am now I still have no idea what the culture of that church sounded like. I can
Yeah,
read about it. I
sure.
can I can study it. I can know all the facts and dates about who wrote what music in Germany and Austria and wherever. But there is nothing that I could study at the university now that would help me understand that culture. It's like almost like we stripped the music away and left the culture behind in the past. And so that's where my thought, then I'm thinking, okay, so now we could potentially be teaching gospel music in the university. Do we risk doing that to that art form as well? You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
that's true. That is true. Because in the yeah, in the article that Melanie Burnham that she wrote, it was essentially talking about whenever whenever gospel was performed in Japan, it was appropriated because they were introduced to gospel through Sister Act 1 and Sister Act 2. They would even put on the clothes, they would have their hair and these styles, and they would perform this music, but had no idea of the religious impact that it made and as to why
Mm,
it became so popular, quote unquote. But then, of course, as we've been mentioning, this cultural experience as well too, which they saw, and they're like, "Oh, this looks fun. Let's do it." But the way that Hollywood glamorized this was it drew people in. So you got you got to have both experiences. You got to be able to marry the stage. You got to be able to marry the history together in order to get a full aspect of it. But I don't think gospel can be effective if you get rid of the spiritual component of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard people make that argument before where basically as soon as you take gospel out of the church at all,
Mm-hmm.
it stops being authentic.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, the church was founded upon. I'm not going to go to a black church and expect to hear nothing but Chris Tomlin or Darlene Shack or you know Gary Oliver. Do those churches exist? I'm pretty sure. But a predominantly black church, there's certain you expect to hear. There are certain practices that you expect to hear. That's what makes the black church so iconic. That's what makes it so coveted because of what happens in that space. I would not I would not be an advocate to go in and say, we're going to strip everything of gospel that comes from this church. It just ain't going to happen. No,
Hmm.
because then I am denying myself of my history and the thing that made me who I am. That is the thing that gave me voice. And I, that will be a slap in the face to our history as well, too, because we see how gospel influences other genres too. um you see it, and it's there. You see gospel in hip hop, you see gospel being performed at, for example, Lizzo talks about how she grew up in the Church of God in Christ, and it's just a part of people's being that you just can't take away, especially
Yeah.
once it's in it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I've got one more question for you, and this can be, I guess, another kind of thought experiment, and we can. This has been really interesting. So I have all the faith in the world that people listening to this and my audience, if they fall into the category of medium to low melanin in our skin, we are the ones that are very genuinely wanting to approach the music that we make and diversify the music in our classrooms, etc. So if you could leave us with, if we're a white choir director or even white-ish, but we want to do some gospel music in a way that is maybe we don't realistically have time to do what I did, which is to go hang out with Maria all day and see a church and immerse myself in those experiences. How do you get started? And what would be the things that you would recommend as a director's like first place to go for research? Is it books? Is it recordings? What would you tell the person? Hey, this is what you need to hear so that you can really get this sound in your head.
Go raw. And what I mean by that is go to the church, go and just being open. I think about the way in which we learn music. I can teach a choir a song and I'll give them the sheet music. And they will be so gun-ho. Like they will hold this music like they are holding on to the last $5 in their wallet. But then when you teach them a song by rote and then show them what they just sang, it's a different feeling. So I would tell anybody, go in, if you want to look at stuff, because people have an awareness of the basic tenets of the Black church. They can tell you about the preacher. They can tell you what the choir is going to do. They can tell you how the choir may have on robes. But go in and just immerse yourself in the culture. Like anytime any conductor studies music, they read, they ask questions by those practitioners and those culture bearers. And gospel is no less. So get to the church, see what it feels like, because the feeling is what you're also going to be going for as well too. Yeah. There is the collegiate performance of gospel music. There's a high school performance of gospel music, and then there's the church embodiment of gospel music. So you got to know how to get the feeling out.
Yeah. I know that some people would feel this way because I felt this way at first, but the idea that, I would be nervous as a white person to just show up at a church. But then my advice, and I want to see what you think about my advice, is I started to realize that if somebody showed up like to where I was because they wanted to learn more about how I do my music, I'm going to be super excited you're there. Yeah. Like what a compliment that is. And I discovered that was true when people found out why I was at Maria's church. They were just all like, at first, being honest, there were people looking at me skeptical, like, what is he doing here?
We've seen white people come to churches and shoot Black people. So
right. But then once they figured out why I was there, they were super excited I was there. And I think that's what would happen to our colleagues too if they go just show up on a Sunday morning. And if somebody says, "Oh, who are you?" "Oh, I'm a choir director, and I want to learn. I want to teach my students about this music, and so I'm just here to learn." You'd be really surprised at how excited people would be. Thoughts about that?
No doubt. And so you feel you're the only white person in the church. I get it. Try this. Try being a white person in a university where you have no choice but to be there and you feel uncomfortable. But you are there because there is a mission that you were trying to accomplish. And whether or not people understand the mission or not, you're there because you deserve to be there. And you wanted to go to that church to see what it felt like. So good. I'm glad that you did do that. But that's just a sliver of how people who are at these predominantly white institutions or at their jobs, who are Black, and how other people look at them when they get to the space and they're like, what are you doing here? Mm-hmm. And you sometimes have to, you don't have to do this, but through your work validates your presence. And that's just a little bit of what the other side feels. So I'm glad you went. And what I will say is this: go again. Go again. And maybe even try to, because there are different styles of Black worship that you will see in different churches. So yeah.
Yeah, and it has to start somewhere. Like that, there's that sincere attempt to learn has to start somewhere, and then we just grow and we learn more, and even through conversations like this. So, Emorja, this has been really, really fun. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Yeah, I appreciate this so much. Thank you for having me on, man.
Awesome. Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of an episode. If you are still listening, that means you're one of the people who are MVPs of the Choralosophy podcast, the people who stick around to the end. Of course, the ways to help are to use the Choralosophy promo code at sightreadingfactory.com, mymusicfolders.com, 3minutetheory.com, endeavormusicpublishing.com, graphitepublishing.com, and of course you can join the Patreon. Link is in the show notes. You can also subscribe at Substack and chip in a few dollars a month there. All of those things are great ways to help, and of course like, share, leave comments, be part of the conversation. That's what this is all about. See you guys next time.